You had mentioned earlier, like how the best sprinters in the world, for them to run faster, they have a shorter contact time, but they're probably in most cases expressing a higher amount of force in a shorter contact period.
Sprinting is really interesting example because, like I said, the faster you sprint, the shorter the contact times get. And for elite level sprinters, you're like 100 milliseconds, so definitely faster than even most of your phases in the discus. Elite level sprinters do something a little bit interesting where they actually increase the force more so during the first half of their stance phase. I can geek out over it because I teach some of it in my strength and conditioning classes.
What's up, everybody? We are live for a Garage Strength podcast here in Ramona, Oklahoma, where we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Kristof Kipp. He's a world-renowned biomechanist. Dr. Kipp, welcome to our podcast. I'm extremely excited to ask you a lot of complicated questions that will leave me confused, but hopefully we can digest and decipher your answers and provide some resolutions for the audience. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Dane. I'm equally excited to be here with you today. It's shaping up to be a great weekend, hopefully for some big throws. And feel free to call me Kristof. We know each other a little bit, so we keep this as informal as you want.
Okay.
And let's get into it.
Yeah, so I want to go right into the fact that you guys are here. We have a throwing event, and a lot of people that might be watching or listening, they're into like sports performance and anything along those lines of like how to become more athletic, more explosive, more powerful, more impulsive. And I wanted to like dive right into what specifically at an event like this would you be gathering to sort of, what data would you be looking to gather to identify specific aspects of throwing or even of, output from an athlete?
Yeah, so we're here with our 8-camera markerless motion capture system. So we're out this morning already and set up the cameras around the circle. And what we're looking for is actually, we would like to do recordings of pretty much every single throw in the competition. Then we use our motion capture cameras to run the data that we collect through a software program that allows us to create avatars of the thrower as they're going through the entire throw. And from that data, we're able to basically answer any questions about body positions, joint angles, and even down to how athletes generate some of the momentum and impulses that you're describing. And hopefully look at what happens when they throw far and when they maybe not throw not so far.
Yeah, that would probably be, that's actually probably, this is the easiest way that you should, or this is the definite way that you should not throw. So
it helps having a spread, right? If you have a guy come out and throws 70 meters on every single throw, it's just a very descriptive project of this is what you do well. But if we have some throws that are a little bit better, a little bit worse, right? Even if it was, like we talked earlier, reaching pretty good release velocities, but the flight wasn't as good. Right, I think that all provides us with very good information to then maybe take back and say, and tease that apart a little bit more of what helps a person throw well. What did they do well on a long throw versus a throw that maybe again didn't go as far.
Right. So is this something that you got your PhD from Oregon State? Is this what you researched or were interested in when you were in college, and then getting your doctorate, or how did you get into this specifically?
So it probably depends on how far you want me to go back, but
all the way back to when you were 7 years old.
So I used to throw in college. Right? I used to throw at Boise State. So I got my bachelor's and master's at Boise State University, and was pretty fortunate to be around a lot of great throwers at the time. And
you have some unique roommate stories.
We'll share those maybe a little bit later. But yeah, shout out to some of the friends from back then. But yeah, I got into throwing, and as most throwers probably can sort of identify with, you're always trying to look for ways to get better. Yeah. And I was going to school doing an exercise science undergraduate degree or kinesiology undergraduate degree, and like the physics and math aspect, and of course throwing, there's a lot of that built into the technique. And so, pretty much when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Boise State, I was in a kinesiology program, was fortunate enough to get a start in a biomechanics lab during my senior year, and then stayed on for my master's and sort of transitioned out from the throwing world, not actively throwing, because again, I was a fairly mediocre thrower, I would say.
Yeah.
Especially compared to part of people who were in that training group, like Jarrett Rome and Ian Waltz back then.
Right.
Stefan, if you're listening to this.
Yeah. Anyway.
So I started my master's working in a biomechanics lab, and my thesis project at that time was actually on post-activation potentiation strategies for throwers. So looking at shot put performance after different warm-up protocols.
Say the title of that again.
Post-activation potentiation.
Post-activation.
Post-activation.
Oh, post-activation potentiation. Okay.
So how can we potentiate force output
right
with different warm-up strategies? And so we used some of the throwers that we had on the Boise State track team for that. And then most of that experience throwing, and we also did some weightlifting research, sort of stopped at that point. When I transitioned into my PhD, it was a little bit more away from the sports performance side and a little bit more down the clinical side.
So I want to actually go into what you just referred to with post-activation potentiation. And there, I just recently read a paper on back squat method, using a back squat to potentiate kicking power for Muay Thai fighters. And I was sort of comparing that, and they had the minutes of rest and stuff. But I wanted to go into specifically in the realm of throwing, the discussion around Ryan Krauser, this past year, he did I guess you could in theory call it a post-activation potentiation session in the morning, and then 12 hours later competed. And even there's some papers, I want to say there was one from 2018 where they saw post-activation being more effective with 24 hours of, I guess, would you refer to as latency maybe? What did you guys...
different time courses, I think, for these effects. It's been a while. I mean, since that project, and so it's not in my realm of expertise anymore. But at the time, definitely, we're looking at the effects of any sort of priming or potentiating exercise
within a workout.
Yeah, within a workout. I mean, they're always sort of long-term, short-term effects, fitness and fatigue effects that you're trying to balance.
Okay.
And of course, people will respond differently depending on their training status, depending on their strength, relative to whatever potentiating activity you choose.
Right. So if it's a super heavy lift potentially, and you have an individual who tends to be on the weaker side, they might not be able to handle that as well.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah. So that was one of the things we're sort of trying to tease out again with throwers at the college level. You never have that large of a training group, so you're not able to account for all variables. But that was part of the idea as well, is that we try to use a push jerk exercise to potentiate shot put performance.
Okay.
So something pretty specific, but you can overload musculature that's directly related to performance in the event, versus just a sort of normal standard warm-up like you would have in competition.
Right. Okay. So I guess that takes me into, I think, some of the things around sports performance, or maybe even based off your shirt, the athletic and human performance. I think there's a real maybe inconsistent or confusing environment around terminology. And it's I think one of the areas of struggle possibly that strength coaches might have is the use of terms that they might read in research, and then they internally interpret it one way, but it could not, it may potentially not even mean specifically the definition that they're trying to use. So I did want to bring up real quickly if there was some easy way to define words like power or force or strength and impulse even, and maybe is there a specific or easy task that maybe you could recommend, or your coworkers have discussed, possibly hey, maybe these are terms that we can use consistently in research that the strength and conditioning world could adopt and maybe improve their usage of these terms. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or...
Yeah, so first thing that comes to mind is I had a friend in grad school, and he would always tell us that the first step to wisdom is calling things by their right name.
Yeah.
And so I think, proper definition is definitely important. That said, I also want to try to acknowledge that there's a point where you can be overly pedantic as
Right.
well. We might be talking about the same thing, and if you're conveying the idea correctly, then it might not be as much of an issue. But definitely things on the research side, right? We try to be very careful when we try to write articles that then people will hopefully read, right? That don't just sit in journals on shelves. And I think power is one of those ones that comes up a lot. And I would say there's been quite a bit of literature that's been published actually about power and misnomers and misuse of the term power. And I guess when you're thinking from a physics perspective, right, the easiest way, or one of the simplest way, right, we can define power as the rate of doing work. That's probably a good starting point. So we can calculate power as a product, or as a sort of, right, taking the mechanical work that somebody produces and measure that via an output somehow, and then accounting for the time that it takes somebody to complete that work.
Okay.
All right, so that's a good starting definition. Some other ways you can get to the units of power, right? Calculating wattage essentially, and you can get there a couple different ways as well, by either taking the force multiplied by the velocity. It gets a little bit tricky depending on how you then calculate the force,
Right.
as well. And
How do you define force?
Aside from the bending of the space-time continuum. No, I think when in some of the research that we do, right, when we, for some of the weightlifting research, probably the easiest way to start. So for weightlifting, we start with, obviously, we're lifting a barbell. So we have the mass of the barbell. We multiply that by the gravitational constant, right? So the gravitational force that's acting on that. And so, it's the sort of pull that's exerted by the force of gravity on that barbell, and then we try to measure or calculate the forces that the lifter is then applying to the barbell to overcome the gravitational force. Right, so again, they're exerting a pulling force on the barbell, and the sort of net sum of that is then what we're observing, right? It's like, how fast are you accelerating the barbell? What velocity does the barbell reach at certain stages throughout the lift?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's still like, it's almost just hearing that when you're even just defining force, it's still, it's like how it's going to be measured is going to be very, very, I feel like it could be a big gray area possibly. Maybe not the methods of measuring it, but how somebody might determine force output.
Yeah, I think with sort of the proliferation of ways to measure power, right, via apps or other technologies and devices, having an idea of the way that people are doing that, or the way that the data is produced or outputted, I think is important. And then there's some potential pitfalls by not accounting for all the forces, right? If you only look at the gravitational force acting on the barbell, it's super easy to calculate because you know the mass, you know the gravitational constant. That's a force, but you can multiply that then by the speed, right? So if you have a velocity measuring device, you can take the product of that. That is a sort of quasi-power output measure, but you're not accounting for the actual force that the lifter is applying to overcome the force of gravity.
Right, okay.
So you're missing certain pieces, right, of the puzzle potentially.
Right. How would you define impulse then?
So impulse, right, again, mechanically, force applied over a certain period of time. So if you're, again, going back to the weightlifter example, right, the weightlifter exerts a pulling force on the barbell. If they pull for, right, half a second or 1 second, we would take that force that they're exerting on the barbell to move the barbell, and look at the product of those. Okay.
Now, I mean, I almost feel like when you're referring to impulse in that sense, okay, that's where I'm gonna say impulse in that sense to me sounds like the way you would hear power used in the world of strength and conditioning. Is that, I mean, maybe I don't, is that an accurate or inaccurate analysis? I mean, I'm even thinking through that, and I'm going like,
No, I think you're sort of on the right track. I think from a physics-based perspective, right, some people would say we should start with first principles, and first principles would say that we start with the impulse momentum relationship, which is an easier way to think about what you're doing rather than calculating power as sort of a secondary variable based on the amount of work that you're doing, which again is dependent on how much force you're producing. And so I totally agree that I think in most cases thinking about force applied over time, right, leads to an outcome, right, a change in velocity of an object you're trying to throw, an object you're trying to lift. It's probably an easier way. Might not be quote unquote as sexy as talking about power outputs.
I mean, it even just, I think that's accurate. But I even was just thinking, I'm like, you're talking about power outputs or whatever, but why is there not, like, almost, you steal your term there, sexy. Why not have like, okay, this is for this type of sport. Let's say it's a sport like weightlifting or throwing. This is the time, the optimal time of force application that leads to, a large amount of impulse display or expression. Yeah. And then you could look at maybe a sport like sprinting. When they're sprinting, this is like the optimal time that we see. And then you look at a sport, like, I'm trying to think through the lens of these other sports that might be over a longer period of time. I don't know if that, maybe I'm going down the wrong hole here of like identifying timelines for specific sports to then understand how to optimize their performance. Does that make sense or no? Or would that go back to power?
So I'm trying to unravel all that.
Yeah.
Or no, I think the way what you're describing, where you started from getting into a certain position, applying force in the correct way, right, over certain amount of time. I think that's the way that we should think about it. And you could apply that same perspective or apply that lens at two different sports. And so the sprinting example is another one, right, is that where you have to produce very high ground reaction forces in order to run fast. The interesting thing about sprinting is the faster you run, the less time you have to produce that force.
Right.
So there are certainly these trade-offs where even though we say we want to maximize impulse, you can't just say, well, produce as much force over as long as the time as possible. So there are different task constraints that feed into that.
Right.
And maybe that's where we, right, maybe collectively, strength coaches, people in academia, right, is not being as deliberate or just not applying those lenses rigorously within those constraints.
So when you see, okay, so thinking through that lens with time, when you've broken down or when you've analyzed data from weightlifting, right? Like, what would be, let's just say data from weightlifting, what would be the time period of force application on like a snatch on average, or maybe with like the elite lifters that you've analyzed that have been on stipend from USA Weightlifting? So pretty freaking elite. Like some world champions, some Olympic caliber.
Yeah, world record holder.
Yeah. So what have you seen as like that timeline of force application for weightlifting, let's say?
Yeah. So then to make it easier, we'll just talk about the pull phase.
Okay.
Right? So first pull transition, second pull, which, time frames for the snatch anywhere from 700 milliseconds to maybe 800 milliseconds or so. So definitely less than a second.
Okay.
And clean and jerk definitely varies a little bit more, but right around that 1 second mark. Probably an easy sort of just mental anchor, right, is that you think of the clean and jerk as, or sorry, I should say in the clean, the pulling phase in the clean as lasting about 1 second, snatch being a little bit faster, 200 milliseconds or so. Do
you see, okay, so then it's like, now if we would shift that to, let's say, I'm pretty sure you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but have you done research on long jump?
No.
Okay. Dang it, I thought you did. Okay, let's go to throwing. Okay, we're in throwing then. We take the timeline now. Let's say a clean pull phase is a second. snatch maybe 700 milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
What would the timeline be of application, let's say, for discus throw? And I guess how do you measure that too? And where are you differentiating like the back to the middle to the front? How is that?
Yeah, I mean the discus throw, and if you're talking about the time periods of force production, and I guess if we break down the throw temporally, right, you have coming out of the back, double support, single support, flight phase, second single support or transition phase, and then your second double support or release phase.
Okay.
And so those all have different, I think, somewhat thrower specific, right? You have different temporal signatures, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say I think the release phase, if you look at, you definitely looking at less than a quarter of a second, less than 250 milliseconds, where both feet are grounded and you're trying to produce as much force into the ground, trying to maximize sort of the transition of or creation of angular momentum and trying to transfer that out into the discus.
So do you feel that there is any data out there that could show or could not show, or maybe there's not data yet, I don't know, around something like a pull period, be it weightlifting? I would assume it would probably be more of a weightlifting derivative type movement.
That would be quicker than
a quicker movement pattern relative. Like if this individual at 700 can display, a large amount of force, they're also, if they're trained technically in another sport that has a shorter time frame of force application, that will likely have a greater carryover.
Yeah, and so I guess depending on how you want to talk about carryover, right? If it's just based on the temporal structure of that lift, you're right. I think that you would have to go to something like a weightlifting derivative, right? If you want to match time frame of force application. Yeah, so either pulls from a hang, counter movement shrugs, where you're also sort of by extension, no pun intended, you're lessening the range of motion.
Right.
So shortening the time range of motion, and you're just trying to look for maximal force output from the legs in a quarter second or so.
I guess that's an interesting. I'm going to get a little off top. Well, maybe not entirely off topic here, but one thing that we tend to use is we'll use boxes, especially with like football players, and we'll have 1 or 2 box heights, and I've always liked to improve that load on the bar from 1 or 2 boxes because the range of motion is shortened. And in my theory, I don't know if this is accurate. If the range of motion is shorter, but someone can, let's say somebody can clean 160 kilos from the floor. Mm-hmm. If they could clean 160 kilos from a 12-inch height, theoretically, that individual would likely be displaying a higher level of impulse because the pulling length is shorter.
Pulling length is shorter, right?
The distance would be...
You would probably still need similar velocity,
yeah,
endpoint velocity in order to turn the bar over.
Right.
And then...
So they would have a greater rate of force development in theory. They would still reach the same peak velocity, probably.
Yeah, I guess it would be interesting to see, because if they reach the same peak velocity, if they reach the same velocity with whatever variation, it means that they're creating the same impulse. But if the time is shorter. But if the time is shorter, then you're right. So that's right. These are fun discussions to have, because then you get into the sort of individual determinants of, like I said, impulse and trying to dial that in. I don't think there's enough data on sort of broad research data on what do pulls look like from the blocks. Mm-hmm. I think there's a little bit more from the hang, but I could see what you're getting at, right? The other thing is that you're from the blocks, you're going concentric only versus maybe using a stretch shortening cycle or some sort
off of a hang.
Right.
Yeah. I guess my next question then would be, if you're looking at, I'm trying to think through the lens then with the sprinting, because you had mentioned earlier like how the best sprinters in the world, for them to run faster, they have a shorter contact time, but they're probably in most cases expressing a higher amount of force in a shorter contact period, contact time. How is that similar? Because when you just mentioned 250 milliseconds at the release for a discus throw, how might that be similar to the ground reaction force that a discus thrower might be expressing when they're in that single support period in the middle of the circle to the finish? Is there any research on ground reaction forces in throwing and the impact of I guess that would be I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think I think sprinting is really, really interesting example, because like I said, the faster you sprint, the shorter the contact times get. And for elite level sprinters, you're 100 milliseconds, so definitely faster than even most of your phases in the discus. And then elite level sprinters do something a little bit interesting where they actually increase the force more so during the first half of their stance phase. I'm not that much of an expert on sprinting, but I can talk to this a little bit because I can geek out over it, because I teach some of it in my strength and conditioning classes.
Right.
But yeah, with respect to discus throwing, or actually any throwing event, there's actually very little force plate data out there. Right now, if I think top of my head, I think there's one study that looked at the force plate based analysis of the discus throw. And for any throwers who are out there, right, LJ Sylvester was one of the co-authors on that study.
Okay.
So I think it was at the time, one of the rings at one of the Olympic training centers was actually instrumented with force plates, because that's sort of what you get into then is you need fairly large force plates that have to be sunken into the ground. You need to have some platform sort of built around. So they're not easy studies to do. We brought some portable force plates here with us. So
So we have to use them. Or at least try to
do something, even if it's just some stand throws.
Honestly, I just thought Jaime might be throwing today. I don't know if she would be willing to put that into her shoe. She might.
Oh, those are the insole. Yeah, so we brought those pressure.
I wonder
so
she might be willing to do that.
She can definitely put them on if she wants, and
if she doesn't feel it, she probably would do it.
Yeah. Sure.
Not to go too off. I think that's I guess that might take us into what are the tendencies that you would see in someone, or based off the data, that you might see in an individual who can successfully produce a large amount of angular momentum, or maybe even deeper. Well, yeah, let's just start with that.
Discus throwing?
Yeah. Specific to discus throwing, sorry.
Yeah, so there's a couple of really interesting things about when you're talking about angular momentum and the discus throw, right? So we know from previous work that over 90% of the horizontal and vertical release velocity components are due to angular momentum that's generated, right? So angular momentum, let's just say in the transverse plane, so rotating around your vertical axis, right? And it seems that one of the major things that's the main things that sort of interest is that most of the angular momentum that throwers generate is actually out of the back of the circle. Most throwers will slow down or decrease in the angular momentum that the entire system contains as they go through the middle. And some will be able to either create a little bit more angular momentum in the release, or at least maintain where they're at.
Okay.
And so then, right, if you're saying a lot of angular momentum is good for reaching high release velocities, most throwers actually generate most of the angular momentum they have out of the back. So coming out of the back of the circle, really, really important. Or optimizing the creation of angular momentum out of the back, really important. And so when you think of the way that we can do that, right, we can only generate or change the angular momentum of the system when our feet are in contact with the ground. And so we have different ways that we can increase that angular momentum. We can manipulate sort of how we're pushing into the ground. We can use our limbs in space, right? So most discus throwers, right, we sort of think about how we're using the left arm coming out of the back.
Mm-hmm.
right leg sweep action out of the back, right? So we have call those our free limbs, right? The limbs are sort of in space that we're trying to manipulate and trying to manipulate them to optimize the creation of angular momentum out of the back.
What do you think there? It's like, okay, if you're creating this, I mean, creating angular momentum, the hard thought I feel like is to move quickly. You feel like you have to, and you have to be grounded to create, to generate greater angular momentum. But the issue then is that you're pushing into the ground, and that can also result in you leaving the ground if you think about it in a specific way of like extension. And then that in turn leads to your inability to create any more
well, I think
momentum.
that's where, I mean, you asked earlier about the definition of, right, certain definitions. And I think one definition of strength in a way is, right, your ability.
I don't think you answered that question, by the way.
Yeah. I waited until this because I knew this was coming. Is it, right? Strength, I mean, the expression of strength is sort of like optimal expression of force in the right direction, or in the having the directional components. And so I think you're right? If you're pushing really, really hard in a direction that's not optimal, you might be extending, you might be jumping up too high. So that's a technique component to the expression of strength. And so most of these things, right, we talk about these as being vector quantities, right? So it's not just how much force you're generating, but also what is the direction of that force. And so this is, again, having some force plate data would be amazing, because with the force plates, we'd be able to say not just how much force you're ultimately generating and pushing into the ground with, but what is that, essentially, what is the sort of moment arm of that vector with respect to our center of mass, right? And so,
can you explain how, like, the aspect of vectors for everybody as simply as possible?
So, sure. So vector, right? I mean, when we talk about these sort of quantities that we're talking about, forces, velocities, right, they have a magnitude. So how fast are you releasing the discus? Is it 22 meters per second? But then we also want to know what is the direction of that velocity component. So are you generating 22.4 meters per second at a very, very low angle, which is easier to do than, right, trying to produce that vector, or produce that velocity at a vector of about 70 degrees. And so same idea, that if you're doing a three-dimensional sort of motion, like in the disc where you're turning, pushing hard is kind of an easy thing to do, but you have to be able to push in just the right direction, be balanced, right? And so the creation of that angular momentum is dependent on how you're controlling the direction of how you're pushing into the ground, right? How you're angling. I don't want to say how you're angling, but right. So like shin angle out of the back, important thing. So if that, what would be interesting to know, right, is how actually related is that to the force vector, the ground reaction forces that you're producing.
So do you think there's any correlation between, or is there any evidence of correlation between specific lifts or specific movement patterns being done optimally that can enhance the creation of angular momentum while exiting the back of the circle in a rotational throw?
So evidence, I would say, scientific evidence, no, right? I totally don't want to discount, like, when we have these conversations, and I guess there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and so sometimes we have these conversations with coaches, right? Even with the weightlifting stuff we do, there's a lot of just innate sort of, or knowledge that they have and that they bring, and probably more often than not is something that when we find, it's like, yeah, this is exactly what some of the coaches said, right?
Right.
USA weightlifting camps, when Piro says more speed through the middle, it's like, oh, that's what the velocity tracking actually shows.
It's interesting you brought that up. It's like, not to get away from the question that I posed about lifts that can help generate more angular momentum, but one thing that's unique, and I think that a lot of people do struggle with, is when they're reading a study or a paper. It's like, how do they synthesize the information and then say, like, okay, this paper refers to this aspect, how can I improve it? And even looking at, like, some of the research you guys done, and you've analyzed a couple of our lifters, Haley, I remember, had this weird movement pattern where there was like on her snatch, there was this weird issue with ground contact after she had finished her pull. And what was interesting is like we couldn't figure out what was going on, but then I was watching her lift at our gym while watching the video that you got or watching the graphs and seeing that her right foot would like slide out, then reapply force, and then slide out even further. And it's like, you know, I know I'm going away from this the discussion, but it was an interesting way to take the data that you had sort of discovered and then apply it and be like, okay, how can I, in an applied setting, get Haley to slide her feet without having the hiccup of the slide? And I don't know if that's clear, but it's like then
I can see the video, and I exactly remember that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the hard part then becomes is like, how can we have, let's say, or how do you see using all this data or information that you might read on, like I like to just go on PubMed and I'll just type in random search thoughts that I'm having, like bench press shot put, see if there's any papers, right? Like or back squat vertical jump, see if there's any papers. How do you think strength and conditioning coaches can take this information that sports or human performance researchers are analyzing or gathering? What's like the easiest way if they don't have the privilege to talk to you in a direct conversation? How would you think that somebody can optimize, like a coach? How can they optimize figuring out these are the movements that might help you create more ground reaction forces to generate better angular momentum in the discus, and also at the same time, these are ways that you can decipher?
I mean, I would say just reach out. I mean, most of us, scientists who sit in the ivory tower and do these studies, I mean, we're more than happy to talk to people who are interested about this.
Yeah,
for sure. And I'd say, right, if you're reading studies, there's always typically a list of authors that has a corresponding author.
Yeah.
I would always say just reach out. I mean, most likely people are more than happy to talk about the work that they do. And I will say, I mean, sort of just to add, I think it's been a really sort of neat and I'd almost say like fulfilling experience to do some of this work with USA Weightlifting, working with some of the coaches and athletes more one-on-one, because it takes us away from just thinking about doing research for research's sake or because it would look cool in a publication, but actually doing this work to hopefully improve people's performance and help them make more teams, make it to the Olympics. And just the experience of going through that and having these conversations where, with the coaches in terms of these are some things that we find, right? Sort of matter of fact of force plate analysis or bar path analysis and maybe some additional things. But then having these conversations of what do you guys actually look for? What is something that you would like to see in the next analysis, right? And we've done this for sort of 3 years as an ongoing process and trying to hone that in a little bit more. And so, I think it's been a great experience overall. So hopefully we can do that for the discus.
Today.
After we collect more data here. I'm going to come back to the other question real quick, 'cause, I don't want to skirt the question about resistance training exercises, looking at force production and carryover. I will say, I think one of the really difficult things is that forces, right, the kinetics of the exercise is typically not something that you observe, right? We observe the kinematics, just the movement pattern. Yeah. But oftentimes you're the best guess as to what actual sequence of muscle activations or what forces that you created actually led to that outcome. And so just thinking about the USA Weightlifting example where we have the force plates in the ground, we're able to use that as part of this, more robust overall lift analysis, I think provides us with some information on that. Yeah.
It's interesting is like sitting here, I'm thinking about, I was thinking about Mary actually. And I'm like, I wonder if there's some way to break down some of her performances in research and comparing it to throwers because she was a thrower.
Yeah.
And how she's transitioned so well. What are the similarities? And she was I'm pretty sure like a multiple time D3 All-American, like very solid in the throwing realm. So I guess it's just like an interesting discussion around that, where it's like,
Hey, you need that guy Will Fleming to come on this podcast.
yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, but I agree. I think it would be really interesting if you had video or yet analysis and to see like what sort of, again, the movement profile did she exhibit or use to throw far, right?
Yeah.
And what was the temporal structure of the throw? Yeah, because that would be a perfect sort of case study of what was the carryover. If there's specific characteristics.
So would you say it basically is like, okay, if you, as a strength and conditioning coach, if you can analyze the vectors or the vector or consistent vectors. So if you have like, to me, if you're looking at like a closed skilled sport like weightlifting, I mean like relatively close,
yeah,
skilled. If you can analyze the vector of the force application there, but then you look at open skilled sports like football, American football, or lacrosse or something, it really would come down to analyzing the force, the most consistent force application, or kinetic, would it be the kinetic application relative to those sports, the similarity like to a sport like football, analyzing the way that the force is applied in those specific vectors, and then trying to train that way, or trying to find the best movement patterns that will transfer to those sports.
Yeah, so seeing what the, I guess overall what you want to know is what's the level of transfer you could expect between different exercises or different sports. Yeah, and trying to create biomechanical analyses, and then the toolboxes to allow you to take a task, right? So throwing is somewhat easier, right? Throwing to weightlifting, because you have
Jaime's mad.
I see that. You have a limited number of tasks, but when you talk about American football, the number of skills or tasks that people perform as part of their sports and conditioning, right? And when they have to perform those tasks, obviously as you said earlier, it's a more open environment, and so their ability to be just their adaptability, be able to respond to different conditions in the environment is probably more important.
Yeah.
Certainly, right, throwing, you got to be able to adapt to circles that are faster or slower, or the different weather conditions as well. But yeah, I think that would be super fun sort of project to carry out. It'd probably take a lot, but at this point we're just sort of speculating.
I've got one final question before we close this out, and I might, after we are done, I might beg you to do another one of these tomorrow, but we'll talk about that later.
No problem.
I'm thinking about one discussion that I thought was interesting. Was you had mentioned some weightlifters have great vertical jumps and some of them do not.
Yeah.
But on the grand scheme of when you're analyzing their data, they all are strong in this traditional sense. So what would be the differentiating factor between those athletes that are strong and can jump well and those athletes that are strong and don't necessarily jump as well as their maximal?
So yeah, I was mulling this over because we briefly had this conversation yesterday, and it might actually get back to this idea of what sports, right? What is their sports participation background?
Okay.
Certainly, I mean, most of the weightlifters who've come to the camps that we host at Marquette, right, they're phenomenal jumpers in terms of jump height. Right? Jump height being primarily determined by how much concentric impulse you produce. Right? They're all very good at, once they hit the bottom of the squat or the bottom of their kind of movement, they can turn things on pretty rapidly. But how they get there varies quite a bit. And so it seems like for some of them, again, jumping is not their main sport, right? But it seems like if they wanted to improve their vertical jump performance, you could probably do some training in terms of trying to optimize their force time curve profiles, if you will. But yeah, that was just sort of, I settled on that yesterday after thinking this over a little bit more, is that probably sports background, where they come from, if they have a lot of experience jumping in their previous sports. So you imagine some come from gymnastics. Jumping and landing is a big part of what they do. Some kids who never did that much, they start lifting weights and found out they're good at it, and they find their way into weightlifting that way.
Yep.
So if you've never done much sort of stepping into a jump, doing that training. But I think the common thread was that, once they hit the bottom, they're able to turn things on rapidly, pretty astonishingly, and just maximize that concentric impulse. So.
Okay, that helps. All right, Dr. Kipp, Kristof, thank you for being on the podcast.
No problem,
and I hope we helped some people. And if not, just keep rewatching this over and over again. And maybe we'll have another one in the future.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Happy to answer any emails. And
until next time, guys, peace.